Hello. Hello, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this event on transport policy. We've entitled it Transport Policy Between the Green Deal and Energy Security. Will RED III, the EU's new Renewable Energy Directive, get the numbers right? My name is Sonja van Renssen. I'm a journalist based in Brussels, and I'm editor-in-chief of Energy Monitor, a new website dedicated to data-led stories about the energy transition. And we launched close to 2 years ago now. So this event was in the works well before the latest crisis hit us. I know at Energy Monitor, we basically parked everything on the 24th of February and refocused all of our coverage on the crisis, and since it's become the war in Ukraine. Prior to that, and exacerbated by the latest, we had, of course, the energy price crisis. Prior to that, we had the COVID crisis. And it's against this backdrop of successive crises that we're talking about Fit for 55 and the Renewable Energy Directive today. It seems like everything is, the only certainty is more uncertainty, and yet we do have legislation on the table. We still have long-term goals. And that legislation is still being negotiated and is still going to be agreed. So we have a new backdrop, but as such, we still have existing files to discuss. And I think the latest crisis, the Ukraine war, what it's done is really given energy security a fresh prominence. And the question now has become not just what can we do to decarbonize transport in this case, but what can we do to decarbonize and reduce our reliance on Russia and preferably other countries too going forward when it comes to our energy and probably other supplies as well. And the follow-on question from that is, how do we do all this whilst keeping energy and in general the cost of living affordable? Or maybe we're prepared to pay more these days for certain things than we were previously. So the focus today is against this much broader backdrop, nonetheless firmly on RED III, the EU's proposal for a new renewable energy directive. And specifically, what should that be aiming for now? We're going to have two keynotes giving us some input for a panel debate that will follow. We will have some time for questions, obviously over the course of the debate, but also after our two keynotes, if there are specific questions for those that come to mind. You can submit your questions via Slido. So you go to slido.com and the code you want is RED3. And if you type that in, you'll have an opportunity to submit your question. And we'll keep an eye on those and try and incorporate as many of them as we can. Apart from that, today's event is being recorded, so you will be able to rewatch bits of it if you like, at least for a period of time online after today. I think that's probably it from me for the beginning. I suggest we get stuck into the content of today. And so I'd like to welcome our first keynote speaker, Carlo Hamelinck, a partner at studio GearUp, and he's been there for close to 2 years now. He may be familiar to many of you from previous more than 15 years at Ecofis, which has become Navigant and Guidehouse today. And he's someone who specializes in biofuels and bioenergy. He's originally an engineer with a PhD in advanced biofuels and international bioenergy supply chains, and is working today at Studio GearUp on helping both companies and governments mobilize and procure larger amounts of biomass for energy, and basically trying to work out how we can enlarge the feedstock base, presumably whilst ticking all the boxes of affordability, sustainability, et cetera, et cetera. So Carlo, looking forward to hearing from you. What do we want from RED III under the current circumstances in particular?
Thank you, Sonja. I hope you're seeing my main screen.
Yep.
Very good. Thank you for your kind introduction. And yes, happy to be here today. And the topic of my presentation is will RED III get the numbers right. I will focus mainly on two aspects. Will we have enough action, climate action in transport. And I'd like also to highlight one or two misconceptions around the sustainability of biofuels. So if we zoom out a bit and we look at overall developments of emissions from transport over the past decades, and we combine this with the proposal for the RED III, then actually at first we thought there was a typo when it stated minus 13% emission reduction in or intensity in reduction in the fuels. Because if we look at what happened since 1990, we actually have a 30% increase of emissions. So we would rather need a 30% decrease also of fuel intensity. So a much more drastic change is needed if we want to get on climate path. And what you also see in this graph from the pocketbook of the European Commission is that transport is the only sector that has increased emissions since 1990, whereas all the other sectors are doing their best to decrease emissions. And this is really bad because it also limits the overall achievement. So this means that we need to, just a second, try to move this away, that we need to, oops, that's not what you want. You're now seeing my,
we can see your cursor a little bit.
Yeah, okay,
so
good. Now I think it's good. So we need a much more drastic change. And we need to scale up activities. The internal combustion engine vehicle needs to be replaced with electric vehicles. I think everybody's clear about that. And it needs to be done faster. But the effect of that is only becoming really clear after 2030. And this also means that in the coming decade, well into the 2030s, we also need to do everything to green the emissions, to reduce the emissions from internal combustion engine vehicles. And that can only be done by renewable fuels. If we look at the total energy use in all sectors in Europe, this is a nice picture that basically, if you look at the height of the bars, it represents the share of the sector in the total energy use. So this is energy use, and you see that transport is over a quarter, almost a third of all energy that is being used in the European economy. And almost all of that energy that is being used concerns oil and petroleum products. Some other sectors like industry, households, and others have much opportunities to electrify, and that electricity is partially renewable today and will be increasingly renewable. There is a bit of electricity in the transport sector, and it's increasing, but not much in the past few years, and that is because the baseline is from electricity in rail transport. So the fraction of electricity in road transport is really tiny if we consider it in the whole of transport. Renewables are increasing, but only so much, from with less than 1% per year at the moment. So what we really need to do is we need to accelerate on the electrification, but even a doubling or a tripling or a tenfold of electric driving in the road is hardly changing the red small bar on the side. And this is also because there is such an enormous amount of legacy vehicles in the market, and they are driving, and this is also, of course, including ships and maritime and heavy duty. So oil is really what we have there and what needs to be replaced by renewable fuels. If we take another look at the developments of, this is the emissions in road transport, so that is heavy duty and light duty together. Is the tank to wheel emissions, so it's, let's say, in the ETS perspective. We see that to achieve drastic greenhouse gas emissions, we are not really on track. The Fit for 55 proposes an economy-wide 55% emission reduction compared to 1990. If everybody would play its part, then the road transport would have to arrive at the green dotted line, which is clearly, let's say, impossible. And this means that other sectors need to move faster and harder because transport cannot do it at the moment, not in the way that we're approaching it now. So we need to faster phase out ICEFs. We need to do everything. We need to make the new ICEFs that still come on the market, make sure that they have a better emission profile. But we're only replacing about 4% of ICEFs each year. So it takes 25 years to replace all the cars in the market with new types of vehicles. And so this also means that even with a very strict CO2 emission performance standard, we the total fleet will always lag behind by 10, maybe even 15 years of, let's say on average 12.5 years, it will lag behind the performance of what is being introduced. So if we shift the figure a bit to the left, then we can look a bit further to the future. And the proposed ETS for road transport and buildings could play an important role also to arrive at climate neutrality. And the ETS path for both sectors combined points to zero emissions, tank-to-wheel emissions, by 2044. This is for both sectors combined. It could be that buildings move faster and that transport does not do anything for a while. Then you would, let's say, follow the above side, the top side of this parallelogram that we've illustrated here. Buildings are a smaller sector, so you can only delay for so much. If transport would move first, you would go very steep down, and the middle line is if there is a kind of a pro rata contribution from both sectors. And clearly this means we would still have to move faster than the current track that is proposed. If we zoom in on the emissions and we filter out the effect of electric driving, then the remaining emissions are illustrated by the top of this graph. So electric driving has already taken off a lot of the emissions, and that is also why it is steeply going down, but still arriving at above zero around 2050. So the yellow dotted line in this case illustrates what would be needed to arrive at zero emissions by 2045. The path could be different, but the end point is fixed. So even if buildings move faster, we still have to arrive at zero emissions from transport by 2045. The red tree, the mandated part of the Fit for 55, only achieves so much, and we need about double the amount of fuels by 2030, even on top of what is mandated by the red tree. If we compare the red tree volumes, so also taking into account all the increasing demand for transport, etc., and also the FuelEU Maritime and the ReFuelEU Aviation, so it's the combined transportation sectors, we need about 42 million ton oil equivalent in 2030. And this is more than double the amount of renewable fuels that we currently have on the market. And all this growth, or most of this growth, the policy says, needs to come from uncapped fuels. So that is advanced biofuels, renewable fuels of non-biological origin, e-fuels, and maybe there's a few other options if we allow them. The red path, sorry, the ETS path would even require much more, with a tip around 2040 and then decreasing because electrification, let's say, takes really over. And this would be really drastic, but necessary to achieve a climate emission reduction in proportion to the other sectors. And mind you that the other sectors have done already a lot, and actions in those sectors will be increasingly more difficult. So a kind of a pro rata for the remaining path is not unrealistic. So this leaves a gap and means actually that on top of the red 2, what the red 2 seems to suggest, we may need double as much other renewable fuels. I'd like to step over to a somewhat different topic, but at the end, I'll try to bring the two items together. Renewable fuels, according to the directives, in the directive, there's some default values for greenhouse gas emissions. So there's a bit of confusion about what is the real greenhouse gas emission saving falling from renewable fuels, from biofuels specifically. And I've illustrated just a few, which are cited a lot. And often policymakers think that the default values are the real values, but the policy actually has these default values to motivate producers and resellers of fuels to develop options with less emissions. And you can see that the actual certified emissions over time have continuously decreased. And so we're actually achieving quite a good performance thanks to the policy that increasingly steers for this. And hopefully the RED 3 focusing on emission reduction of the fuel intensity also further will stimulate the development of better fuels and better options, less fertilizer, but also less energy use or more renewable energy use during the production of those fuels. If we look at the combination of direct emissions and indirect emissions, because indirect emissions will be important, then often people add the default values, and they, on top of that, they add the ILUC factors, often from, let's say, the GloBiome study, to which I contributed about 5 years ago. And this is wrong, because those GloBiome factors are only modeled emissions for a certain situation. If we look at new insights, new GloBiome models led to lower emissions for most of those fuels. The biofuels volume between 2010 and 2020, which is, let's say, the GloBiome period, was much lower than the modeled percentage of 1%. And also biofuels that have been produced and put in the market before 2010 were not addressed by GloBiome, and they actually likely achieved much less, and in some cases even zero ILUC, because they were, for example, produced on set-aside land. And part was achieved by strong yield improvements, which, in terms of low ILUC, would also count as low ILUC emission options. So with direct and indirect emissions combined, we can see that for most of the options, we have a strong overall greenhouse gas emission performance and emission reduction. Now, it can, of course, still be better. This is not a carte blanche for future growth directly, because you always would have to check what is the effect of a doubling or a tripling of the amount of biofuels. So we need to have low ILUC options, as mentioned in the red. We need to insert additional crops in existing cultivation systems. So we will, this is then also per se without ILUC. I think we need to invest much more in food fuel synergy and feed fuel synergy. I think that will also be maybe a topic of the conversation in the debate. And of course, we can also avoid direct emissions at the end, where we want to avoid them, the deforestation and the expansion into peatland. So to come to conclusions, twofold. On the one hand, we need a clear track to zero emissions from transport before 2050. The ETS path points to zero emissions by 2045 or 2044, actually. The RED 3 reduction of emission intensity seems to lack certain urgency. I think we need to go much, much further. Electrification is good, but not fast enough. So the effects only become visible later. And in the short term, we need a much larger contribution of renewable fuels. We think that the ETD and the ETS will improve the position of renewable fuels. By the way, on the ETD, for years, people have advocated for a differentiation of tax tariffs for renewable fuels, and it was always impossible. And now we see overnight that governments are able to change the taxation for all the fuels in reaction to increasing fuel prices. So we are asking, actually, can you just have make sure that you use this momentum also to improve the differentiation between renewable fuels and fossil fuels. Investors need confidence in market prospects. And at the moment, we're focused very much on lists like Annex 9A and also 9B, by the way. But rather, it would be better to have strict requirements on what do we allow, what do we not allow in terms of performance, and then have industry to find also solutions for that. So we actually propose to develop an innovation and investment agenda to scale up and accelerate renewable fuels production. And sustainability should be the driver for renewable fuels. The biofuels direct emissions have continuously decreased. The indirect emissions are much lower than previously was estimated. We need a better appreciation of the emission reduction that is achieved by renewable fuels, and it needs to be recognized. And sustainable feedstock strategy should also achieve scale up and improving sustainability at the same time. And there's a few options for that. And I'd like to leave it with that. Thanks again, and I look forward to questions.
Okay, thank you very much for that. There's one question that's come in, and I could probably add one or two to that, which is how much does the trend of building bigger cars impact the consumption of fuel?
Yeah, nice question. I would not know. I'm not sure if that trend is everywhere in Europe. So you would really have to look at everywhere in Europe. What is, I think, an issue is that, yeah, a lot of cars are just driven by one person. So you need 1,000 kilograms to just move one person around, which is obviously ineffective, inefficient. Yeah, there's maybe a trend for some larger cars, but I think that actually the CO2 emission performance standard will also push to smaller cars in the end, because it's yeah, you really have to achieve for the whole fleet that is being sold or put on the market, you need to achieve ever lower emissions per kilometer. And yeah, some regions maybe big cars are popular, but I don't expect that this is a lasting impact on the whole fleet.
Okay. And I had a question. I mean, you made very clearly the point that the 13% carbon footprint reduction, so proposed in the original RED 3, is not enough from your perspective. It's not even enough to get us back to 1990. Never mind below emission levels then. And I thought you also did, you also highlighted the problem of just the legacy fleet. So whatever we do introduce now, there's, you said, on average, 10, 15-year delay before that's reflected across the fleet. And the other thing I noted was you said we might need, or we will need, twice the amount of renewable fuel that the RED 3 currently suggests. So I wondered, based on that recommendation, how do you translate that into an actual policy recommendation? So what should that 13% be, if not 13%, or what needs to change? Assuming we have policymakers who are hopefully attending today, yeah. How do they take your conclusion and turn it into something that they can work with?
Yeah, the 13% obviously also includes some results from introduction of electric driving, and there's multiplication factors, etc. So it's difficult to translate. But I would say roughly double of that, or maybe triple of that, would be a good direction. But what I think is also necessary is there's a fear of a lock-in, and I think there is not a lock-in. I think the electrification is inevitable. We should have a strategy for increasing, but also a perspective of when it will decrease in the future. And so what does it mean? And those biomaterials will not be lost. They will flow into bioeconomy. If there's e-fuels, yes, the electricity would be needed for electric vehicles as well, but there's only so much electric vehicles. When there's more electric vehicles, at some point we need less e-fuels, and the electricity can flow back. So it is not a dead-end road. It is part of a bigger story, I think.
Okay. But in terms of actual figures, yeah, that's difficult then. So the closest you can get is to 2 or 3 times the 13%.
Yeah, I didn't calculate what it would have to be.
Fair enough. There's a question around biomethane. How likely is that to become a viable alternative for transport in the EU?
Yeah, actually, seeing also the more recent developments, I assume, but I'm not an expert, that all the biomethane that we could get hold of should go to the, let's say, current use in households, for example, to really make us less dependent of foreign natural gas. I like the idea of methane in transport, and I think it's nice in some subsectors, but also means the introduction of new vehicles, etc. I think we need to have a strategy on the vehicles, but we also need to have a strategy on making sure that the existing ICEFs are driving as sustainable as possible. And then, yeah, I'm not sure if methane is necessary there. I think it's at the moment more needed elsewhere.
Okay, thank you. One more question that's come in. I think there's a few, bigger questions, supply chain and so on. We can take those, save those for the debate because you'll be there as well. A question about the EU agricultural Green Deal could be a problem or even counterproductive to increase renewable fuel production in Europe. Do you have a view on that? European agricultural policy and how useful or not useful is that for renewable fuel production?
Yeah, it's difficult to exactly react to it, but I have some ideas there that there has been a lot of land abandonment over the decades in Europe, agricultural land abandonment, and the reason of that is that the prices, one of the reasons was that it was not attractive. Prices are too low. So also in the view of today, people may think this leads to kind of a competition between food and fuel. I think agriculture also needs serious prices to exist, and the high prices in the supermarket are not caused by anything happening on the farm. It's rather the supply chain. So we have abandoned land which we could remobilize. We can create more room in existing agriculture by smart rotations, sequential cropping, etc. There are several companies and countries that have invested a lot in yield improvements by smart agriculture, digitalization. So there's a lot that is possible. And finally, there's also some research in finding new agricultural land that is not suitable for anything else. Mm-hmm. Different types of unused lands, degraded land, whatever. So I think we can remobilize that, and we could have maybe a combination of various types of agriculture. Okay.
So in particular, see an opportunity for abandoned or unused land to be taken back into circulation for this too. Okay.
As well, and I think there's even also a political dimension to this that is really important. A revitalization of the rural areas is also necessary. But that's a bit beyond my specialism. But I feel that there is quite a gap between urban and rural societies, and we should really make sure that there is also an economy for rural regions.
Okay, thank you. I think we're going to leave it there. I know there's more questions have come in, but those are bigger questions, and I think we'll save them for the panel. And Carlo will join us for that, so you'll have a chance to address him there again. Thank you very much, Carlo, for that.
Thank you, Sonja.
And let's move then to our second keynote, Uta Pfeiffer, Head of Mobility and Logistics at the Federation of German Industries, the BDI. She's originally a mechanical engineer and first started working on environmental protection in the railway sector, worked at Siemens Mobility, has also worked at the Association of German Transport Companies and the German Aviation Association. And she's been in her current position with the BDI for just over a year now. And her passion, as her career path suggests, is sustainable mobility. So looking forward to hearing from you about how, I guess, in Germany and beyond, the transport sector decarbonizes, and I guess what, if any, rethinking and remodeling you're having to do in these days of upheaval.
Yeah, thank you very much for the kind introduction and the invitation. Ladies and gentlemen, you all know the challenge that will remain even if the war is hopefully over soon. Climate change is a fact and challenges society to limit our emissions. Globally, we need to achieve zero emissions by around 2050, and we already have to halve emissions by 2030. And this also applies roughly to Germany. And with the Climate Protection Act 2021, the federal government has once again significantly tightened its climate protection targets. So the law stipulates a reduction of 65% by 2030 and greenhouse gas neutrality by 2045. However, current policy only achieves half of the 2030 climate target. So what has to be done? It is precisely this question that the study Climate Path 2.0 answers and provides the answer on the basis of 3 dimensions in particular. First, what must happen technically? So we identified 110 technical measures. And second, what does it all cost? The implementation of climate protection measures requires additional investments of around 860 billion euros by 2030. That means about 100 billion euros per year. And third, what should policy do to enable this enormous challenge? For this purpose, over 60 policy instruments have been defined. If we look briefly at the broad industry, a radical approach is needed in every sector. And before the war, for example, we thought that the coal phase out should be brought forward, a phase out in 2030 instead of 2038. And in order to still be able to guarantee security energy supply, a doubling of gas-fired power plant capacity is necessary. And in the building sector, for example, the oil and gas boilers should be dispensed with wherever possible, for example, by installing heat pumps or district heating. But the war calls everything into questions. When will we be able to get out of coal? What role will gas play in the future and where does it come from? And when we could phase out this? Can we really get out of nuclear power? These and many other questions will have to be discussed and decided socially and politically in the near future. But let us now turn to the topic of mobility. I think despite the changed political situation, the measures I'm about to present to you are still valid. Transport must also halve its emission by 2030 in order to reach the target. And you have to remember that that's only 8 years. And the challenge is further intensified also in comparison to the other sectors by the fact that despite considerable efficiency improvements, especially in combustion engines, emissions are virtually stagnating compared to 1990. This is due, we have the question, among other things, to the fact that road freight volumes have increased significantly and customers have developed a stronger preference for larger and higher powered cars. And car kilometers have continued to rise. But we would not be here today if we could not answer the question of how the transport sector can achieve the 2030 targets despite all the challenges. For the transport sector, there are 4 central levers for reduction emissions. First, the model shift. Second, more efficient drives and traffic control, the drive change, and green fuels. Let's take a closer look at the first lever, the model shift. A cost-efficient achievement of Germany's climate targets requires a shift in transport performance from cars, trucks, and planes to more climate-efficient modes of transport, such as trains, ships, and buses. And the switch to rail, both of passenger and freight transport, is an essential pillar for achieving Germany's climate targets. Overall, passenger rail transport performance should increase by 1/3 in 2030 and by half again in 2045. The picture is even stronger in freight transport. Here, freight transport performance will increase by 40% by 2030 and by as much as 70% by 2045. So we see a significant increase in transport performance by rail. On this page, you can see how many percentage of the transport performance must be reduced in each case of the modes of air, road and air in order to achieve the model shift to rail. The next lever we'll look at is the drive change. It saves the most emissions compared to the other three levers. Let's start with passenger cars. In the target path, battery-powered cars account for more than 40% of new registration in 2024 and even 90% in 2030. And on average, a newly sold passenger car in Germany remained in stock for about 15 years. In order for the car stock to be largely converted to alternative drives in 2045, they must account for the majority of new vehicles registrations 15 years earlier. That means in 2030. So in 2030, we will have 40 million e-cars. And what you can also see very clearly is here in the graphic on the right, is that there are still many cars on the road that use fossil fuels. And we need a solution for this too, but more on this later. Unlike in passenger transport, a greater variety of technologies for alternative drives is currently emerging in freight transport. Only in the case of light commercial vehicles will the battery drive also dominate in the long term. From today's perspective, several technologies can be established along different applications for heavy trucks. Battery trucks have cost advantages in short and medium haul applications, while hydrogen powered trucks are better suited for long haul applications according to the foreseeable state of the art. And in the case of passenger cars, the share of alternative drive systems is also increasing in the case of trucks to a total of 76% of new registrations in 2030. Yes. Of which 58% are trucks with battery and 18% with fuel cells. Compared to passenger trucks, compared to passenger cars, trucks remain in the fleet for a much shorter period of time. This is why, despite achieving zero emissions in 2045, a comparatively higher proportion of combustion trucks can be sold in 2030. And a change of propulsion on the scale described above requires the establishment of a domestic and Europe-wide supply of charging infrastructure and hydrogen filling stations. And especially for the penetration of electromobility, the concern about a lack of charging options is currently one of the biggest hurdles. For this reason, a sufficiently extensive range of charging and refueling options must be created, preferable ahead of the ramp up of the technologies. In the case of charging stations, there is also the fact that different charging profiles and requirements have to be covered. This requires a mix of private connections, charging options at the workplace, and public charging options, for example, in car parks or supermarket car parks, but also in terminals and at ramps. As well, we need also the fast charging points. Even such an ambitious ramp up of alternative drives, as we have just seen, however, is not sufficient to achieve the German sector targets. Therefore, a comprehensive climate program should not only include the penetration of alternative propulsion systems, but also address emissions in the existing stock via green fuels. At this point, it is important to emphasize alternative drives and green fuels are not against each other, but rather with each other. To achieve the German climate protection target, the entire remaining fuel demand must be met by green fuels by 2045. To achieve the German climate protection target in 2030, green fuels will cover 22% of the remaining fuel demand in the national target path, of which 10% alone will be covered by e-fuels or PTL. In addition, considerable quantities of biofuels and hydrogen will be needed to achieve the German climate protection target in 2030, about 10 or 2% of the remaining fuel demand. Even with increasing electrification in road transport, the amount of e-fuels needed after 2030 will rise continuously, especially through use in international maritime and air transport. And to ensure that these quantities are available by 2030 and can be produced at the lowest possible cost, the first large-scale plants would have to be commissioned as early as the middle of this decade. At this point, it is important to emphasize that PTL volumes will continue to increase after 2030. Even with increase in electrification of road and rail and the associated decline of green fuels in national transport, the total demand for green fuels will continuously increase until 2045 due to the required decarbonization of international air and sea transport. These will become the main consumers of green fuels as fundamental technology transformations such as electrification and hydrogen do not currently appear realistic on a market covering scale with less than 24 years. Let us now turn to how high the investment must be for this and which political measures can stimulate these investments. To implement the target path in transport, additional investments of 220 billion euros are required by 2030. The transport sector thus has the second highest investment needs after the energy sector. The largest share of investment, it's 35% at 74 billion euros, is flowing into the private and public charging infrastructure as well as hydrogen filling stations. The extensive switch to cars and trucks with alternative drives requires almost as much additional investment. And 41 billion euros will be invested in the ramp up of production capacity for e-fuels, which will mainly take place abroad, where renewable energy plants and plants for desalination, electrolyzers, CO2 capture and fuel synthesis, as well as the logistical connection, will have to be newly built. And the expansion of the rail infrastructure ultimately takes 25 billion euros. But the question is, how are these investments now stimulated? To accelerate the transport transformation, very different implementation hurdles must be overcome. This requires a broad mix of instruments. Effective regulation must make the consumption of fossil fuels less attractive, and it must create significantly stronger investment incentives in the very rapid development of infrastructure, the switch to alternative drive systems and investments for sustainable green fuels. Therefore, a number of different instruments are needed. Increasing the price of fossil fuels in order to make the consumption of fossil fuels less attractive. We already have the situation because of the war, and we see what happens. Politicians getting nervous and look for solutions to calm down the voters because of the high prices. In order to create the conditions for a steep market ramp up of electromobility, the expansion of charging infrastructure and hydrogen filling stations should be extensively promoted. In particular, through investment support to overcome non-economic phases in the pre-construction phase. To overcome the acquisition cost disadvantages of alternative drive, purchase bonus for battery and hydrogen cars should be extended beyond 2025. And in order to give trucks with battery and fuel cell drives a sustainable full cost advantage, the truck toll should be based on the CO2 emissions of the drives and extended to smaller trucks over 3.5 tons. And last but not
least, I'm gonna have to ask you to come to a close in a second.
Yes, yeah. And last but not least, in order to create sufficient demand and investment security for the first industrial PTX projects, despite the high level of technology uncertainty, mandatory transport mode specific quotas for PTX fuel should be introduced promptly. So very important is the revision of the RED 3, the fuel maritime and the refuel EU aviation. And for the ramp up, we need also financial support. This is how the world, and this is how the world looked from the point of view of those who worked on the climate path study. We do not know at the moment what can be realized, but we know one thing: climate change is here to stay. I hope that I have been able to give you an understanding of the measures, the financing requirements, and the political instruments. I think there is more than enough material for the discussion that will follow. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for that, Uta. So Uta won't be joining us for the panel debate. If you have specific questions to her, now is the moment to submit them via Slido with the code RED3. I did have one question. You mentioned towards the beginning, I mean, the war currently, how it's, well, it's getting people to rethink everything, coal, gas, nuclear, specifically for transport. Can you, I know you said the study, its basic conclusions are still valid. Nonetheless, can you give any indication, I suppose, on how your thinking is evolving in these days? And, you know, we're rethinking gas, nuclear, coal. What about oil? And I'm thinking, I mean, we have, you know, various summits coming up in Brussels later this week, and oil imports from Russia are, from the latest I understand, being, you know, sanctioning those are for the first time being discussed, at least by some, as a real possibility. We'll have to see, of course, whether that happens or not. But there's that, so, you know, the impact of that. And I'm also thinking, one of the things you mentioned about e-fuels, most of those would be imported from abroad. So again, with this new emphasis on energy security, energy autonomy, you know, what do e-fuels from abroad suddenly become less attractive going forward? And do you, for example, see a greater role for crop-based biofuels going forward? Should we rethink our sustainability criteria if we say we suddenly need more of those? Those are just some ideas, but maybe just give us a flavor of your thinking on how the latest developments affect, you know, the conclusions of the study.
Yeah, thank you for the whole question. So maybe start with the last point, the crop-based the biofuels. So as you seen in our study, we focus on PTL. We say, okay, we have the biomass in transport, and the percentage will not increase a lot. So, but it's maybe only a German way to focus on the PTL. Yeah, the whole question is what I mentioned before, is one instrument is to have higher prices for fossil fuels. That's the situation today. And why is it important? Because we need the gap from PTL. It's 3, 4, 5 times expensive than the fossil fuel, and so we need to fill the price gap. And as higher the fossil fuel will be, so the smaller is the gap. So maybe this situation will lead to accelerate the transition and the transformation we need today. And so we are, I think everybody in Europe is now thinking about how to get oil not from Russia, then from other countries, but it's not so easy to switch it today or tomorrow. So we are working on this, but I think it's very, very hard to say in future how the world will develop.
Okay.
But we are going to this, and maybe we could accelerate the ramp up of e-mobility.
Yeah. So in any case, so not more crop-based biofuels from your perspective, and just a quick note on the imports, because e-fuels, you said a lot of imports. I mean, imports are not very popular at the moment. Do you see an impact of that at all on the prospects?
Yeah, so we know that we have not the capacity of renewable energy to produce the necessary PTL in Germany. Or maybe some in Europe, but not in Germany. So yes, we have to import this, and we are running in the same system. The independency of energy supply. I think it's a dream that we will need energy from other countries in Germany. Also the PTL.
Okay, thank you. That's clear, I think. Let me just have a look at anything. We'll try and see if there's something specific that's come in. I think where that will be, that's who is going to invest in all the capacities needed for renewable fuels when demand will drop so significantly towards 2045? So how do you make that an interesting return on investment?
Yeah, you know, it's a kind of I don't know if you know H2 Global. It's one they are thinking about this how to ramp up or how to finance a ramp up of PTL, and yeah, I think it's always the thing. If you have new technology and you need the ramp up, you need money from the state to support this, because it's. In Germany, it's a hen or egg discussion, yeah, and so you have to break this discussion. And but there are some contracts for difference, for example, who can help there.
Okay, and also a clarification on the imports from PTL. You're talking about imports from other parts of Europe, South and Western Europe, or imports from further afield, outside Europe?
From outside Europe, I think.
Yeah, so I guess Northern Africa and the Middle East, potentially.
Yeah, Africa, Australia.
Australia, yeah. Okay, and we'll take just one final question then. Well, there's two more, and I'll let you choose which one you pick up on. Tesla has rolled out a charging infrastructure without subsidies. So why should taxpayers pay for the infrastructure of other car makers? And there was a question coming back to your point about we need higher fossil fuel prices. How high should they go, and how do we compensate those who can't pay? I guess that last one's going to be hard to answer. So maybe pick up on the Tesla one. If Tesla can do it, why can't everyone else do it?
Yeah, okay. If you pay 100,000 euros for a car, I think Mr. Elon Musk has some money over to invest in the charger, and it's a business model of from him. It's my. But he opened this. What I get is he opened the infrastructure for all cars. Yeah, it's a business model for.
Okay, unfortunately, not one we've got yet here in Germany. Then. Okay, perfect. Thank you very much, Uta, and thank you for joining us. And do stay and listen to the debate that we're about to launch.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye. So that leaves us with just under 45 minutes for the second part of this, where we wanted to have more of an interactive discussion. I know we've had more questions, so we'll try and integrate those into the discussion as we get going. And joining us now, Carlo will join us again. And we've also got Bernd Kuepker, the European Commission, Dr. Peter Jahr from the European Parliament, Stefan Schreiber, representing the biofuel industry, and we have Calvo Ambel, representing Transport and Environment and NGO, his colleague Laura, and a reminder that the first of the recent crises is not yet behind us, was struck down with COVID yesterday. So he's kindly stepped in to replace her at the last moment, so be kind to him. And what we thought we'd do here is give everyone a chance to kick off, and then we can, if you try and keep your opening intervention to just a couple of minutes, then we could follow up with questions afterwards. So I think you've heard the keynotes. I think the big question remains: what does RED 3 now need to deliver? And if we're saying it needs to deliver a lot more, how do we get it to do that? What should deliver those additional emission reductions? Is there scope for a bigger role for crop-based biofuels? Should we go easier on sustainability criteria? Do we want imports of e-fuels? Do you want imports of anything? And what kind of, just I guess, just to get a sense of what kind of a reassessment is going on in the European Commission, in the Parliament, also within companies and NGOs, and in terms of the narrative and the decisions we now make, the narrative we put out there, the decisions we now make, and with what consequences ultimately for net zero, and now, yeah, with energy security so much more in the spotlight, and affordability, of course, a perennial challenge there as well. So let's kick off, as is customary, with the European Commission. And we've got Fit for 55, we've got the proposal. Everything around it has changed now. So how do you cope with that?
Yes, indeed. I mean, as already expressed, I mean, we are really now facing a new reality. I mean, the war in Ukraine is really a terrible event, which leaves us speechless. And I think none of us has expected that after the experience in the 20th century, we would have such a situation where a country is invaded again. Of course, Europe needs to react to this and is also doing this on many different aspects in many different areas. But energy is a key aspect. And the Commission has outlined already in the REPowerEU strategy a plan to make Europe independent from Russian fossil fuel imports. There are also different measures in play and different actions one can do. One of the key measures in the short term is, of course, the diversification of energy sources. These will also include diversification of fossil energy imports, but it is, of course, not limited to it, and this is not the long-term objective. The objectives of the Green Deal are indeed as important as ever, in particular the switch to renewable energy sources. As regards transport, the Commission has already put on the table an ambitious proposal for the promotion of renewables and low carbon energy in the transport sector, which is included in various policy proposals, including the Renewable Energy Directive. And it's clear that in the phase of the new events, it will be possible to increase the ambition level even further if this is decided by the co-legislator. However, what we have on the table is not ambitious. For instance, we have at least doubled, if not tripled, the level of ambition for renewable energy in the Renewable Energy Directive compared to the current 2030 framework, so compared to RED II. However, with ambition, I do not only refer to the numbers and shares of renewables, but also to sustainability. So with regard to your question, whether we should now be lax on sustainable, I think that's not the way out. In particular, if we are looking on our policy for conventional biofuels, because also here we have seen that the war in Ukraine has an impact. We have, well, already a sufficient increase and shortfall or increase of prices and shortfall of production of agricultural commodities. And in this regard, it simply does not sound convincing to relax the limits agreed on conventional biofuels under the RED II. So the view of the Commission on limiting conventional biofuels has not changed at all during this crisis. And the general aspect and the strategies for transport also have not fundamentally changed. We need to continue to increase the efficiency in transport, in particular by promoting electrification of all sectors where electrification is feasible. And we have to promote the development of renewable and low carbon fuels to be used in those sectors where electrification is not feasible, such as the maritime and the aviation sector. And there, yeah, we try to provide a clear a clear investment case which allows the industry to invest into new production capacities. We know that we are starting from a very low level there. in particular for advanced biofuels and for hydrogen and for hydrogen-based fuels, it is not that we can cover all fuel needs until 2030. We need to significantly pace, but at the beginning, it will also be still a role of an infant industry. This we need to take into account when we talk about ambition. So all instruments there, we can talk about the ambition, but we should not make any compromises on sustainability. I think that's all what I want to say.
Okay, thank you. I should have given you slightly more of an introduction, by the way. I realize you're probably a familiar face to most people joining us today, but for those of you who don't know Bernd yet, he's been working on renewable energy policy at DG Energy at the Commission for the better part of 10 years now, and is originally an agricultural economist. So he knows what he's talking about, in case that wasn't obvious. I think it was. Thank you, Bernd. We can pick up on a few of those points. Let's go to the other panelists first. And next, I wanted to invite Dr. Peter Jahr to take the floor. So he's joining us from the European Parliament, German member of the EPP there, and has been with the Parliament also for more than 10 years, working largely on the Agricultural Committee. Today still sits on that as a substitute. Also works now sits on the Petitions Committee and led the Common Agricultural Policy reform on behalf of the Committee on Regional Development. And I saw you're also on the delegation to EU-Russia parliamentary cooperation. So it seems very topical at the moment. As Bernd said, I mean, we have the proposal that's with the co-legislators at the moment. So I guess you're in a sense at the heart of where the action is. I also saw there is a proposal from your colleague, Marcus Pieper, to increase ambition already from 13 to 20% for transport. Give us a flavor of where things stand in the discussions around RED III at the moment and the impacts of the latest events and how you see those playing out.
Thank you, as well. Thank you very much that you invited me for this very interesting discussion, and also thank you very much for the keynote I could hear before. Because it was very interesting, and most of the speakers said we are in a very, very new crucial situation. War in the middle of Europe that was unbelievable a few weeks before, I would say, and that's why, you say very well. I come from the farmer side, from the farmer's view. And that's why one demand from our side is to say stop with all negotiations, stop and see, wait and see what's going on, because we need an evaluation on every field. Also in that, and that would be also my wish to the Commission, not overdrive, not do usual business. We have to look and see what's going on in the world, and in the end, it's not only the. Right now, it's not only the question of food. It's not only the question of energy. It's only the question of food. What we have right on the table, and nobody knows what's going on in Putin's head. And not only Ukraine is a big producer of wheat and agricultural products, also Russian. And also Russian could say we stop our export for a while. And then we have to look what's going on in the world. That is what I want to say at first. To this issue, and that's why I say thank you very much to the keynotes, because we have to say something clear. What I say, or what could I say from the farmer side? Normally, for the farmer, normally it is easy to make a decision. If the society want to have wheat as for food, we can do this, and for energy we can also do this, and in the end we can change it very, very easy. For the follow industry, for technology industry, it's more difficult, and that's why we need also what should I say, a safe perspective. Maybe this perspective is more important than to support investment, because everybody say if I have investment, I want I want to have this safe. And for the farmers too, I would say what we have on the table. At first, that is maybe it's come again in the focus because of the war in Ukraine. We need, what should I say? We need from the society a signal how we can put together, I would say, the different targets we have. We have to produce food. We have to produce renewable material or renewable energy, and we should produce biodiversity. And not everything go in the same direction, and we have to talk about this. Right now, my personal point of view is we have a good produce a good headline. Every hectare is important. Right now, we should produce biomaterial as much as is possible, and we have to go on that. The second question was very important because there was an old reflection in my mind. I listened to ILO factors and such things, and I think the panelist was Carlo said very or explained it very good. For me, inside the European Union, if we produce material for renewable energy, the certification is clear. We have a common agricultural policy, we have a conditionality, and that's for me the certification. We need no ILO factors, because if we do this in the European Union, then we have the certification very clear. And for me, it was very important. That's maybe the last point in the first keynote. I think in every overview, we see it very well that we also need biofuels for the next 10 or 20 years, I don't know. And that's why we should give this technology a chance. And also the report from Markus Pieper goes in this direction, that we have, what should I say, a safe answer for the farmers and also for the industry, that we need biofuels and we should produce it. And then I say it again, maybe my big wish to the Commission, please stop every legislation work, put it on the table and think about it, does it fit in the new situation? Thank you very much. Thank you very much so far. And then I listen to your question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for that. I think for emphasizing, I guess it's obvious in a way, but yeah, that we really do need to rethink everything in light of these latest developments. And I think your view, clearly you said that's reflected in your colleague Markus Pieper's report too. You're saying we will need biofuels for the next 10 to 20 years, and we should make sure the legislation gives them a chance. Okay, let's move on then to someone coming from the perspective of the biofuel industry. Stefan Schreiber, president of the Association of the German Biofuel Industry, and he also represents his company, Verbio, on the European Biodiesel Board. He's been with Verbio since 2017 and sits on the board of management. He previously spent the better part of 2 decades with Cargo Group. So Stefan is someone who's actually in the sector. I think interested to hear obviously your views on, well, the Renewable Energy Directive and how that should look from your perspective, but also the impact of the latest developments. And there's a recurring question which you can pick up on now, or we can come to it later, about the shortage of corn as a result of the Ukraine war. How is that affecting the use of biofuels? And I guess the broader question behind that is, as Peter Jahr also just said, it's not just corn, but wheat, all of these agricultural commodities, which are potentially becoming suddenly very scarce and pricey resources. And what does that mean for the biofuel industry? Go ahead.
Okay. Good morning, even though it's past 12. So, thank you for the invitation and the possibility to speak to you. So we heard a lot of, let's say, visionary pictures for 2045 and 2050. So I'm let's say, being an investor, if you like, I'd rather stay with the foreseeable future, which for me is probably the 2030 horizon. And I will not judge whether these big targets and big investments until this time of 2050 are achievable or not. I think it's just imagine back 30 years. Could you imagine the reality today? I guess not. So that's why I look at the foreseeable future, which is about 10 years from now. So what I learned in the keynote speaks is something which I like to hear. So let's say to start with, agriculture plays or will play again an important role and also contributes to decarbonization. And I'm happy we start to view agriculture as a part of the solution and not part of the problem. So next to this, and now I will touch upon the question you raised at the end regarding should we limit the use of biofuels in the light of the Ukrainian war and the potential shortage of feedstocks. So I think we have provisions in the RED, which limits the use of food crops at 7%. And in reality, for most countries, it's a bit lower because there's another provision in, for example, in the RED 2 transposition for Germany says the energetic content is 4.4% max for crop-based. Now, should we give this up? Right, in light of the Ukrainian war, at the end of the day, this is the question is there a real physical shortage or is there a price problem, right? So if it's a price problem, I think we should not give it up because then it becomes a very subjective decision. What is the right price? And prices are usually made by the market. And the question is, if we, in the case of Germany, where we are today probably close to 4% conventional biofuels, if we release this, with this solve the problem of the pricing point of agricultural commodities? We don't think so. However, the provisions in most countries foresee a penalty for non-compliance, and if this penalty is exceeded by the market, or if the market price is higher than the penalty, basically the feedstock automatically falls back into the food and feed pool, right? So there is a mechanism already in most of the, I have no visibility on all country legislations, but to my knowledge, in most countries, we have this in Germany, for example. So the other point is, and that now I come back to the keynote speaks, which says there's an enormous amount of renewable energy for the whole society and primarily in transport needed. There was a talk about 220 billion investments, which at the end requires investor confidence, right? To make those investments, because this is an enormous amount for 10 years to be made. So if we say, okay, the price effect in taking feedstocks out of the biofuel market and give it back to the food market, will that solve the pricing point? In our opinion, no. Second, will this reduce or increase investor confidence? In our view, it will not increase the investor confidence, rather decrease, and because it remains open when it will come back on the market. And the question is, investors have had well, they trusted the legislation and while making their investments. So the spillover effect to other investors making those choices based on policies, we should not underestimate. So in a nutshell, to your question, we should stick with the 7% and with the provisions we have in RED 2, but we should not decrease the ambition level for crop-based. But the growth, that will have to come from, as mentioned, from the advanced feedstocks, so Annex 9A and Annex 9B. It will have to come from PTL. And if we really think about very big volumes, I mean, there was the mention of 42 million ton of oil equivalent in Carlo's presentation. The lion's share will probably have to come from PTL, or Riffenbos, as it's abbreviated in the RED 2 or in the RED 3 draft. So that's without a question. So in essence, we need every element which can contribute to the decarbonization of transport. Now, last comment on the RED 2, is the ambition level high enough? Well, if you look to the target level 2020, 2050 or 2045, probably not. And I think Carlo has illustrated that very well. But we also need to see what's realistic. I mean, if we have to mobilize so many billions of investment, mainly from the private sector, we should rather work with a reliable framework, and reliability and that investors can trust the legislation is more important than ultimately the setting another high ambition level. On a detail, is 13% sufficient? In our view, it is not. So it should at least move up to 16%, if not higher. But should it go now to 30%? I think this is unrealistic, right? We are coming from 6% in 2020. The other part is, and this has to do with the construction of the RED3. Yes, we set a PTL target or Riffenbowl target for 2030, but it's a 1-year target. How should investors trust this from 1 year, 2029 to 2030, to all of a sudden increase everything? This is just not realistic. So make it a gradual increase year on year to the desired level, and then you will most likely see the investments coming. But if there's only a 2030 target, investors will start in 26 to think about it, right? That's the reality, and that's over the past 20 years. Same for the advanced target in Annex 9, Part A. Yes, it has a target of 2.2% in 2030, but before it's at 0.5. So we need to have a path towards this 2.2, a gradual increase year on year. This is what investors can rely on. If they make an investment, there's a new or a bit higher mandate, so the investment meets also a higher demand, right? This is the simple supply and demand logic of markets.
I ask you to leave it there, or to come to a close.
I am at the close. I think you had some key messages from me. Make it a gradual increase, leave the 7% for crop-based, and let's say allow all options to be used, and don't start with ideology in eliminating one versus the other, which is not there today.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Let's turn then to our final panelist, Carlos Calvo Ambel, as I said, replacing Laura Buffet, who unfortunately was taken ill yesterday. He's a Senior Director for Non-Road Policy and Analysis at T&E, Transport and Environment, and has also been with the organization for more than 7 years, originally an environmental scientist, so also has a long background on the broader issue of sustainability. Carlos, you have the privilege of going last, which gives you a chance to obviously react to what others have said. But a similar question, what are we looking for from RED 3 now?
Thank you, Sonja. I think that compared to previous interventions that I made myself or my colleague Laura, I think I'm going to be like probably stronger than we used to be, because the situation right now is quite dramatic. The issue that we see is that the conversations about food security and energy security, they have been running in parallel. Basically, we need to have these conversations at the same time. We think that the huge quantities of cereals and vegetable oils that are used for biofuels in Europe, they could be directly diverted to the food sector to alleviate pressure on food prices. The issue is that the war has already, I mean, as you all know, and it has been mentioned by previous speakers, the war has already resulted in increased prices and in supply shortages, both in Europe and beyond. Many industries are already raising the alarm about the increased prices, but they are even going as far as saying that they are running out of vegetable oils for their products. I can mention some industrial baking associations in different member states, the canning industry in different member states, and there are issues about shortages with basic products such as sunflower oil and many others. Even the UN Secretary General has warned that we will be facing a hurricane of hunger in less developed countries as a consequence of the war if we don't act fast. And just to give you an idea, because I mean, you know that both Russia and Ukraine are major exporters of grain to the rest of the world, and the likes of Professor Searchinger in Princeton University has calculated that by cutting by half the amount of ethanol made from grain in both the US and Europe, we will be effectively replacing all of Ukraine exports of grains. So, I mean, I think the debate, at least in the very short term, is clear, is simple. Like using edible vegetable oils and cereals for biofuels reduce the availability of vegetable oils and cereals for the food industry, and therefore the food that people can eat. So in the short term, like tomorrow, we need to stop burning food in cars and trucks. Then when we're talking about energy security and import dependence, I think that we many times forget that an important amount of the feedstocks that we use for biofuel production in Europe, they are imported. And that includes palm, soy, and also cooking oil, which more than half of the used cooking oil that you will expect will be coming from European kitchens, but more than half is actually coming from countries like Malaysia. My last point before I actually move into our policy recommendations, I think that, and that's something that was also mentioned before, because of course we need to meet our target, but our main take is like, in the short term, evidently, we need to stop burning food in our tanks. But in the medium term, I think it's clear that food-based biofuels are not the solution. But there are other solutions. Something that somehow wasn't mentioned in the presentations earlier today is that we can increase the Commission proposal to have like more ambition on things like CO2 standards, not only by increasing the ambition by 2030, but by increasing the ambition earlier on, both in 2025, having an intermediate target by 2027 that can actually deliver a lot of emission reductions in the short term. As Carlo was saying, like cars drive around for quite a long period of time. It is also true that newer cars are the ones that are driving the most. So the earlier a zero emission vehicle, such as a battery electric vehicle, is sold, the earlier we get the most emission reductions. So therefore we have to go faster on that side. I think given the situation, I'm not going to talk about the issues of crop biofuels on things like ILUC or the issues around the biodiversity, but I think that those are, of course, important things that we always need to keep in mind. But I think the focus definitely should be now about the food shortages that we're seeing around the world. So from our perspective, we're asking the Commission that in its communication on food security, they should include a suspension on the use of food crops for fuels short term. Again, we are not only NGOs asking for this, there are scientists, there are experts, there are industry players, like for instance, the German Poultry Association are asking for the same thing. I mean, again, I cannot say this strongly enough. In the short term, we must prioritize food over fuels. If countries that were highly dependent on imports from Ukraine and Russia, we need to make sure that we let those same raw materials available from Europe and beyond, and we put them at the disposal of those countries that can actually face famines.
I'm going to have to ask you to come to a close.
Yes. On the red, I think it's clear that we should move away from crop biofuels as soon as possible, and of course strengthen the standards for advanced biofuels. And the red should focus definitely on renewable electricity as the main transport fuel. And finally, when we're talking about things like PTL made from renewable hydrogen, the use should be targeted for sectors that have a difficult or they don't have an alternative, such as aviation and shipping. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so a contrasting view from what we heard from Stefan Schreiber. I see two requests for the floor. I wanted to give Carlo a chance to come back, and then Peter Jahr as well. Carlo, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I understand that there is an emotional plea by TNE and placing placing us in a dilemma of hunger versus combating climate change. I think at the moment, biofuels from food crops, it's being capped. It will hardly grow, and there is not a solution really there to put those fuels to the food market. Most of these fuels co-produce animal feeds in terms of DHS and other proteins. So it's not that they are completely burned in the tank. And but yeah, there is already a synergy between food feed industry and fuels industry. And even if from today onwards we would only sell electric vehicles or zero emission vehicles, by 2030 this would mean that we have 40% of our fleet replaced, or less actually, because we have less than 10 years, so it's 32%. This is not directly helpful, and also maybe not affordable. I mean, that is also very expensive and money that we can also use for other purposes. So we also need to be smart with how are we placing the money in the system to achieve multiple targets at the same time.
Okay, thank you, Peter.
Yeah, thank you very much. Three small things. First, I would say I'm very close to Stefan Schreiber. He say we stand with the 70% crop-based biofuels, and I also agree with him that we need targets between now and 2030. That's right. But then the question: what have we to do right now? You can say it's unbelievable that we use food to produce energy and put it in the tank. But on the other side, I want to also ask two questions, but we have to talk about it. Next year, we want to take out 2 million hectares in the European Union out of the production, non-productive feature. Should we do that now? That's inside the reform. 2 million hectares. We can produce on that something for that. And then also I can ask extensive strategies that it fit its situation right now. Maybe we shouldn't give free. We can produce more biomass. We can produce more wheat. We can produce more reps and so on and so on. That should be the end. And by the way, right now that's also a question of physiology, because nobody knows what is Putin's next step. If Putin give the agriculture export free, he's also a big trader, then this is very another situation. On the other side, Putin can say, I wait and see. Nobody want to give me money for my material, that's why I stopped that. And that's why we should give this, at first, it's my farmers' agricultural politics view, we should give a strong signal that we want to produce much as is possible. No non-productive feature. We want to produce more on this arable land we have. That could be a sign. And then we have to wait and see. Nobody knows what's going on in the next week and the next months. But not only say we should forbid the biofuels. That is maybe this answer is a little bit too simple. Don't forget the non-productive arable land, and don't forget also extensive strategies. We should also change that for this moment. That I want to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Carlos, you wanted to come back?
Yeah, I have to disagree with what Carlos said. I mean, I'm not creating the debate between like climate versus hunger. First of all, because food-based biofuels, they are not good for the climate in the first place. But I think that that's a debate. I know it's hard for the industry, and I know that TNE has been working on this for many years. In the past, we will put out a study that will look into, okay, how much the demand for biofuels is increasing the price in the global markets, and it was all, let's say, a little bit abstract. Right? And then there was a lot of debate, and it was an academic debate about, okay, so it's affecting food prices, how is that impacting the poor, and all of that. But today we are, I'm sorry to say, we are in a dramatically different situation, and I cannot say this strongly enough. Like in my home country, I'm coming from Spain, now for several weeks, they have been rationing sunflower oil in the supermarkets. There are full industries that are saying, guys, we don't have enough vegetable oils for the next few weeks. So for the first time since the biofuels debate started in the early 2000s, we need to make a choice. And we cannot afford, in the short term at least, to keep burning food in our tanks. I think that, I mean, it sounds crazy, but there are associations in Brussels, like EPUR and the European Biodiesel Board, that are actually calling to burn more and to produce more biofuels as a consequence of the Russian war. For me, that position is highly irresponsible. Like, in a moment of a food shortage, we cannot burn, and we actually need to burn way, way less to make that available for both the European market and for those in need in the short term.
Thank you. We're coming up to the final minutes. I'd like to give Stefan a chance to come back, also on what Carlos just said, and then Carlo, and maybe we'll finish with Bernd. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I want to reply to Carlos' comments, and I think I'm a bit provocative now, but I think you are using the crisis to basically kill something which you wanted to kill already for a long time, right? Which is the crop-based biofuels. In reality, the world needs wheat, right? Wheat is hardly used in Europe or the United States, which you mentioned in biofuels, right? It's corn most of the time. Sunflower oil, it's the same. There's hardly a usage of sunflower oil in biodiesel. So that argument I'm not really buying. I'm not arguing for an increase. You haven't heard me saying this. So I'm saying stay reliable for this industry, because they're also workers.
But the industries that you're part of are actually calling for that.
I'm here as the VDB, okay? And that's the position we are having, and that's what we are communicating, and that's what we stand for. And you can trust us. The other part is biofuels have been bad before. You said it in this way. Is in 20 years ago, we started with biofuels, and it was said in 5 years we will have advanced biofuels, so something better, which is not food or feed based, right? We are 20 years later, and we are still saying in 5 years we will have this. So what I'm saying is make the right policy mix that we promote these, but don't kill the ones which account for 90% of the greenhouse gas savings in transport so far. It hasn't been enough, I agree, right? We would have liked to see more, but this is the reality. Don't kill this. I don't think this is a wise policy make, right? But don't increase it either. I'm with you.
Okay, Carlo, you've asked for the floor.
Yeah, thanks. I'm just wondering two things. How can you state that biofuels are not good for the climate? Biofuels are not automatically good or bad, and I think you can have firm requirements to make sure that we have the best biofuels on the market. And as our analysis has shown, the performance, certainly the climate performance of biofuels has improved a lot. And second, how does TNE propose to accelerate climate action in transport? And I don't see it happening unless you would propose that for 2 or 3 days a week, we stop driving. Maybe we have to come with more dramatic actions in other directions. I don't see it.
I think you and Carlos can probably sit down for coffee after this. Carlos, you can have a 1-sentence answer, and then I want to go to Bernd.
I have a very long answer on how we are actually proposing to reduce transport emissions, but I don't think that fits into 1 sentence. So indeed, let's go for the coffee. Okay.
And the last point you raised, though, Carlo, was ties into a question that come in, which I wanted to put to Bernd. When will we seriously talk about the need to massively reduce transport energy demand overall? We simply don't have enough land or green electricity to sustain the current levels. And I wanted to ask, in the context of the latest crisis and so on, is actually tackling demand, is that part of, or how far is that a part of Repower EU, and is that taking a central stage in our latest policy thinking?
Well, maybe first, to reply to this directly. I mean, the EU does not have a policy to reduce mobility. I think mobility is something very important. It is something which develops, but we want to increase the efficiency of mobility to the greatest extent, and electrification in this regard is the key solution for the bulk of the emission issue, and the amounts of renewable electricity needed for that are also feasible to achieve, also within Europe. Obviously, we need to price all carbon correctly. So if this comes in particular when we look at aviation and maritime, if we price the carbon impact, then we can also provide a framework which achieves climate and mobility objectives in an efficient way. With regard to the other question of the shortage and the food crisis, there are two things we need to look at. We have here a short-term crisis which cannot be addressed at EU level under the RED, because the negotiations will take place. It will take too much time to get any result from that. So here, as the RED is an objective, if action is necessary, this has to be implemented by the member states as an implementation of the RED. And I think this needs to be assessed, what is meaningful, how quickly it should be. But this is a discussion we need to have. That is clear. For the RED itself, we need to see that we need to balance indeed the question of the stability of the framework and the need to promote sustainability. Here, I think I can only emphasize that the RED does not set out any requirements or any mandates for conventional biofuels. The use of conventional biofuels is completely voluntary under the RED, and indeed, member states can reduce the use and can even then reduce the targets under the RED if they do so, because the EU or the Commission considers that the EU should not provide incentives to promote conventional biofuels, and their use should be minimized. So the framework as such is balanced in this regard, but indeed we need to reflect whether we need to apply short-term measures to address the current crisis. But this is something where the point of the ball is in the field of the member states.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you to everyone who sent in questions. I think we're gonna have to leave it there. We're 5 minutes past our official end time, and I'm sure, especially in these current times, everyone has busy schedules and things they need to be getting on with. So a big thank you to those who attended, and most especially to our speakers, our two keynotes, and our panel as well. As ever, we probably could have talked for much longer. I hope there will be at least one coffee as a result of this, hopefully more. What I take away is that we've always had difficult choices, and those are only exacerbated by the current situation. I think it was Peter who said we have land that needs to produce food, fuel and biodiversity. There was supposed to be a nature preservation package out tomorrow from the European Commission that's been delayed. I understand. I think that was only confirmed yesterday evening. That's a whole other chunk we haven't spoken about. So there are real consequences, I suppose, of what's going on. But there's food security, which is suddenly back on the table in a way it hasn't been of late. And again, you have energy security, which I think also hasn't had as much attention of late as it's having today. So not only within each sector do you suddenly have to reconcile decarbonization and security, for example, within energy, but you're suddenly also looking at energy, and then you've got food, and then you've got biodiversity. None of the long-term aims disappear, and there will be decisions that are made that need to be made. And as Bernd says too, there will be, I guess, short-term measures and actions and decisions. And I guess my greatest worry would be that those ultimately decide where we end up in the long term. The long term gets cast aside and decided through these short-term measures with not enough regard for further consequences in the longer term. So that's probably, that's how politicians work ultimately. But that's, I guess, our role as the non-politicians to try and remember the bigger term picture and make sure the trade-offs that are made are sensible from, for once we get to 2030 and ultimately 2050, as well as making sure we're still around to get there, obviously. So thank you very much. And I look forward to continuing the conversation with you all. For those of you who had questions and didn't have them answered, I know there was one more to Carlo. About whether your work takes into account, if you're using land to produce biofuels, the impact on the carbon absorption of that land. Please do reach out to our speakers individually, and I'm sure they'd be happy to pick those up with you. So thank you very much, and see you again very soon, I hope. Have a good afternoon.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Goodbye, and thank you very much for the interesting discussion. Bye.